Okay, we have some people coming in. We will be starting soon. Just waiting a bit for everyone to connect. All right, I think we have enough people. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all, and thank you for joining. Welcome to this webinar. It's also a tongue twister. Haste makes waste. How precaution should guide marine carbon dioxide removal research and governance. My name is Victor Brun. I'm head of science at the Ocean and Climate Platform, and I will introduce quickly this webinar. So, as you all know, climate change is accelerating. The world is not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so, against that, there is a growing attention that is being given to marine carbon dioxide removal. So, these techniques are a range of techniques. For those who are not familiar with it, we also talk about mCDR that aim to increase or enhance the ocean's natural ability to remove and store atmospheric carbon dioxide. Despite this growing interest, there are significant uncertainties that remain. Uncertainties regarding the efficiency, the durability, the impacts of these approaches, but also their social and ecological impacts that are not yet fully understood. So because of all these uncertainties, at this point, our position as a network is that mCDR cannot and should not be considered as a ready climate solution, ready to implement, mature enough. We say also that climate action should not come at the expense of people and nature. And presenting mCDR as a mitigation solution, as a ready mitigation solution, would risk creating a moral hazard and potentially diverting the attention and resources away from proven and reliable techniques. At the same time, with the Oceanographic platform and our collaborators, we recognize the importance of research, particular fundamental research, to better understand these techniques. Not only these techniques, but also more generally, the ocean carbon cycle. Uh, we want these techniques, if ever they are being tested, to be tested with the best available science in the best possible and safest possible conditions. So this is the rationale behind this webinar and the work we have been conducting. Next slide, please. We started some time ago, 2 years ago, and I'm using this also to acknowledge all the collaborators and partners to this webinar, because I forgot to quote everyone at the beginning. So we have the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. Sorry, Pauline, maybe you can go back to the last slide, just so we see all the logos. We have aside from the Ocean and Climate Platform, we also have the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, Oceans North, the Ocean Foundation, and Woods Hole and the WWF. So thank you very much to all the partners. Next slide again, please, Paul-Emile. And so back to the Ocean and Climate Platform and our network. This is to say that so we have these partners, but we have been working with a much larger group on this topic for over 2 years now. It started 2.5 years ago, realizing how complex the topic was and how difficult it was to find a common position grounded in science. So we started by working on a scientific paper that was published last month. You can see it on the left of the screen. Then we just published a science communications report to make the topic a bit more accessible to a wider audience for the general public. And finally, we have this policy brief that is coupled to this science communication report, and that tries to find some common positions within our network. So the goal of today's webinar is to give the voice to those who participated in this work, and to explore all the dimensions in the hour that we have, which is a bit short. I recognize that, but to explore some of the main topics that we have been discussing in these different publications. Before starting with the moderated session, I would like first to introduce Dr. Laurent Bopp. So Laurent Bopp will give first some introduction talk to present us mCDR techniques, the scientific foundations, the different limitations, how it works in 10 minutes. So it's quite a challenge, but I'm sure Laurent is capable of it. Laurent, you're a climatologist, oceanographer, you're specialized in the carbon cycle and how it evolves in response to climate change. You have recently been elected to the French Academy of Science and received the silver medal from the French National Center for Scientific Research. You are a co-author of more than 200 scientific publications, including some IPCC reports, fifth and sixth assessment reports. So I think your CV is the perfect CV to give us this introduction. So without further ado, Laurent, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Victor. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. Pleased to see interests and these discussions on marine carbon dioxide removal. So I've been tasked to basically set the scene. So maybe next slide. So I'll be setting the scene, maybe updating you on some of the latest climate indicators, coming back on why CDR, and then a focus on the ocean, on marine CDR, basically discussing very rapidly the different techniques that are on the scene today and discussing some of the remaining challenges. Next slide. So yes, I think Victor said already that climate change is accelerating, at least still developing, still on the rise in terms of global temperature. And these are numbers from the latest paper by Forster et al., regrouping tens of scientists worldwide on updating the indicators of global climate change 2026. So what you see on the screen is global warming since 1850, and in red I have the two latest numbers. Maybe the one that you may keep in mind is warming for the year 2025, almost 1.4 degrees, and you see that we are not very far from one of the Paris Agreement's goal at 1.5. In addition to that, in that paper, you will find many, many more indicators. The ocean is warming also, over 1 degree since the pre-industrial time. We have also an acceleration of extremes on land with almost plus 2 degrees for land max temperatures. And global mean sea level is still rising, plus 23 centimeters since 1901. So instead of always coming back to the IPCC numbers, this paper updated every year gives you those latest numbers and indicators. Next slide. So from these indicators of where we stand in terms of global warming, in parallel, we know where we stand in terms of how much we've emitted since the start of the industrial period. And there is this very important graph, probably the most important graph of the last IPCC report, that shows that despite the complexity of the climate system, we have this almost linear relationship between cumulative CO2 emissions since 1850, that's what you have on the x-axis, and global warming levels on the y-axis. And this is very important as a scientific result, but it's also very policy relevant, because once you know this relationship, that is somehow driven by this transient climate response to emissions, once you know this relationship, you can compute how much carbon is left to be emitted for any global warming target. Next slide. And this has been done in those two papers, Forster et al. And Friedrichstein et al. And these are the latest numbers, and somehow they illustrate the huge challenge we face in terms of stabilizing global temperature. If we want to stabilize global temperature at 1.5 degrees, basically we have only 4 years of today's emissions left. This won't be possible. You see that if we want to stabilize at 1.7, that would be only 12 years of today's emissions, etc., etc. So this gives us somehow the total amount of CO2 emissions that are left to be emitted for a given global warming target. Next slide. And somehow this has opened a window for CDR, or at least carbon dioxide removal discussions, because we've started too late, because the challenges are huge. Of course, we need to decrease actual emissions rapidly and massively in the next years and decades. But if we want to meet the 1.5 degree targets, even maybe the 2 degree targets, we may need to deploy some of these CDR methods. So that's what you would find in the last IPCC reports, showing how net negative emissions, aka carbon dioxide removal techniques, may compensate for difficult to decarbonize sectors, or may even bring us to net negative emissions. That's what you find on those two graphs from the last IPCC reports. So that explains the surge in the discussions, both in the scientific world, but also in political fora on CDR. So now, next slide, why the ocean is on the scene for many reasons. Maybe I list three of them. The first one is that the ocean is the largest carbon reservoir in the climate-related system, with more than 50 times the amount of carbon you find in the atmosphere. And of course, when you think ocean, and when you think deployment of marine CDR in the ocean, you would have probably less competition for land and water than land-based CDR. Next slide. At the same time, the ocean is already absorbing around 25 to 30% of our anthropogenic emissions. So it's already a huge natural carbon sink with consequences on ocean ecosystems from ocean acidification that you've probably heard about over the past years. And next slide. And what we know also is that depending on the different emission scenario for the next years, the ocean will continue to absorb carbon. And at least at this stage, the ocean sink is quite well predicted by Earth system models, as you see on the right side. And these predictions are in fact in much better agreement between models than what we have for the land carbon sink. Next slide. So this explains somehow this surge in discussions and research on marine carbon dioxide techniques. And in fact, on the table, we have a huge diversity of methods. And this is a simple schematic prepared by our German colleagues that show you those different techniques. And somehow some are based on the biology of the ocean. Some instead are based on chemical processes. You have more technological-based approaches. You have nature-based solutions. You have solutions that would be deployed in the open ocean as opposed to the coastal ocean for some others. And of course, because of this huge diversity, you have some methods that may be more mature than others with very different levels of costs and with different side effects on ecosystems. So I won't go into the details on each of these methods, but you've heard of many of them. Iron fertilization, probably, maybe macroalgae cultivation in the open ocean, but also blue carbon in the coastal system and more chemical methods such as alkalinization. Next slide. So this other graph illustrates how these different techniques may be ranked or may be classified in these different categories. It's another way to illustrate the diversity of techniques in terms of the type of processes they are based on, but also if there are more technological or nature-based solutions. Next slide. And here I'm showing, of course, that mCDR is on the rise in terms of research efforts. And you see a number of publications on a few of these mCDR techniques over the past 2 decades, 3 decades. What you see interestingly is a huge increase in particular for 2 of these techniques, ocean alkalinity enhancement, so a chemical-based technique, but also a biologically-based technique, which is macroalgal cultivation. And we see a surge on those 2 techniques in terms of research efforts in the past years. And on the bottom right, you have a graph from the Ocean Vision website in which they document the different field trials that have happened in the past years or that are planned for the coming months. And you see that you find them in the US, in Europe, in South America, in China. So many groups, whether academic groups only or academic linked with some startups, are somehow deploying some of these techniques in terms of field trials. That said, we still have many remaining challenges that we need to cover. And this is what we discussed in the paper that Victor just mentioned at the start. Next slide. And maybe I illustrate here only 2 of the main challenges, and you'll see the other ones. And I'm sure you'll cover the other ones also in the panel session that you have just after that. So remaining challenges, just an example on effectiveness and the need for monitoring and reporting those techniques. And I use the example of macroalgal cultivation. The idea is to somehow deploy offshore cultivation of macroalgae in the open ocean, rapid growth, no competition for fresh water. And why would it work? Because then the hope is that it would export, or we would export organic matter to the deep ocean where the carbon would be sequestered for decades to centuries. But next slide. We have lots of questions. It's been shown that it's probably far less effective than initially projected. And what you see on the right, sorry, that was an animation that doesn't seem to work, no problem, is that if you apply this technique, if you deploy this technique in the EEZs of the world, of the different countries, the uptake of carbon would happen very far from where you deploy macroalgal cultivation. And that poses a huge challenges for how to monitor and how to verify carbon uptake by the ocean in the case of deployments. Another challenge that I'd like to illustrate, next slide, is linked to ecological risks that Victor already mentioned. And I'm using the example of iron fertilization. Probably everybody knows that the rationale is to add a limiting nutrient to fertilize marine phytoplankton with the hope that some of the organic carbon that would be fixed by phytoplankton would be exported again to the deep ocean. But for that technique also, we have lots of research over the past years, next slide, that show us that it's, again, far less effective than initially projected. We know it's not permanent. If fertilization stops, a large part of the effects would be lost after a few decades. And it's been shown also that we may face significant side effects in terms of ecological risk elsewhere. And this is an example on the right in which you would fertilize the Southern Ocean and have reduced productivity, reduced biomass in other regions of the world ocean, showing how all the regions of the world ocean are connected. So when you touch the ocean somewhere, you touch the ocean everywhere. Next slide. So I've only covered two of the challenges related to the knowledge gaps we have in terms of assessing the effectiveness of these techniques, but also in terms of assessing the potential risks, especially the ecological risks. But in addition to that, you have also social risks or socio-ecological risks that need to be covered and need to be assessed, and lots of questions on the governance that would need to be worked on if at some point those or some of those techniques only are deployed. Maybe last slide. And this is what you'll be discussing probably. These are the main recommendations from Brun et al. 2026. We need to conduct more research at that stage to improve the assessment of effectiveness, but also to improve the methods that would enable a proper MRV if those techniques are deployed. At that stage, we need to limit the potential deployment to its minimum because of the questions on the socio-ecological risks. And we need to strengthen governance frameworks if we want to efficiently regulate mCDR developments. That's all for me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for this overview. It's very useful, and I think it's great that we now have this scientific basis to understand what we are talking about today. If you want to know more on the topic, we put links to the scientific paper that we just published, along with the science communications report that was also just published in the chat. If you're watching us on the recording, it should be made available in the description of the recording. So now we have the scientific basis to understand what mCDR is, what are the different risks, what are the different challenges, what are some recommendations. I think now it is time to dive a little bit deeper into the research and the governance of the research of mCDR. So as we mentioned earlier, the OCP just released this week a policy brief on the issue that was developed by its advocacy working group. And so I'm delighted to see and welcome some of the contributors to this policy brief today. Now I will pass it on to Marine to start this roundtable. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you very much, Laurent, for this a great setting the scene. My name is Marine Nasser. I'm head of international policy with the Ocean and Climate Platform, and I will have the utmost pleasure of moderating the discussion today. I am joined by a range of esteemed panelists. So let me start by introducing them to you. So first of all, we have Dr. Kilaparti Ramakrishna, who is a senior advisor to the president and director on ocean and climate policy at the Woodsole Oceanographic Institution. We also have Sean Owen, executive director of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, Yulika Tribukait, who's a senior policy advisor for ocean climate at WWF, Dr. Caitlin Lauder, Program Manager at the Ocean Foundation, and last but certainly not least, Sarah von der Kayden, the Community Partnerships Campaigner at Ocean North. So I think we can give them a very warm round of virtual applause and start this discussion. And perhaps to get started, I will start by turning over to you, Caitlin. I think Laurent made strong points in his presentation about the risks of mCDR. When presenting macroalgae, he highlighted, for instance, that it might be less effective than expected. Same with iron fertilization that might have some socio-ecological risks. So I would just love to ask you, what are the critical uncertainties that are currently surrounding both the effectiveness of mCDR approaches, but also on these different potential impacts. So Caitlin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a key question. The field is relatively nascent. We are building on a few decades of relevant research, including carbonate chemistry observations in the oceanification research community and early iron fertilization experiments in the last couple of years, as Lauren showed. But we're still lacking confidence in whether these various approaches durably and safely store carbon on the timescales that are required. Additionally, there are whole swaths of coastline around the globe where we don't yet have strong coastal observations of carbon dynamics. I live along the west coast of the United States, where we're fortunate enough to have built an excellent record of comprehensive ocean observations to build on when testing approaches. This includes data on air-sea gas exchange, mixing, circulation processes, all of which factor into how the ocean uptakes additional carbon and how it may or may not be durably stored. Yet these well-characterized parts of the ocean are relatively rare, and so we risk scaling mCDR into other locations without sufficient baseline information to fully understand the current seasonal or annual dynamics of that system, especially given the additional variability potentially already induced by climate change. So without those robust inputs into models, our ability to precisely quantify carbon removal and storage of potential projects can be limited. Additionally, we do have one large connected ocean where activity in one area can propagate changes elsewhere, say with nutrient limitation and phytoplankton activity as water flows and overturns, as Lauren discussed. So in many locations where mCDR may be carried out, we have also not fully inventoried biological resources or assessed ecosystem functioning in these areas. And putting on my marine biologist hat, I can say that the responses of biological life to changing ocean conditions are incredibly complicated. And we're still conducting basic research to understand more about the interplay in food web dynamics and the diversity and functioning of microbial life in our ocean, among many other questions. And this uncertainty is still especially true for the deep ocean, which is relatively understudied and operates on different timescales and with different processes than upper layers of the ocean. But with some proposed approaches, such as the macroalgae cultivation, that seaweed biomass sinking Zoran discussed, they have this potential to rapidly affect sensitive environments in the deep ocean. So these are really complex areas of research. And while our climate crisis is urgent, us co-authors believe we should be prioritizing safe and effective solutions while also focusing on reducing carbon emissions.
Fantastic, Caitlin. This is very clear, and I particularly appreciate that you mentioned durability. I think this is really keen to better understand the effectiveness of these techniques, but really also the impacts. And talking about the impacts, we mentioned the sociological approach. So this means also the impacts that these techniques could have on people. So I will now turn over to Sarah. Sarah, you're, as we said, the Community Partnerships Campaigner at Ocean North, which is a Canadian charity that supports marine conservation and climate action, but in working in partnerships with indigenous and coastal communities. So you know better, the risks on the ground. So I would love to ask, what are the risks that local communities face when mCDR projects are conducted? And why is it so important that when we think about this project, we also develop social and economic safeguards really from the outset?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you for having me here today. Yeah, and I can give a little context about like Ocean's North involvement in this discussion and how it's evolved over recent years. So Ocean's North currently does not have an active campaign specific to marine geoengineering or mCDR, but a few years ago we started noticing several mCDR projects appearing within existing and proposed protected areas across Canada, where I'm based. So I'm based in Nova Scotia on the Atlantic coast of Canada. And so as we started noticing this, it raised some questions about how these activities might align with Canada's Marine Protected Areas Protection Standard. And so we brought these concerns to Sea Blue Canada, which is a coalition of 8 Canadian environmental organizations, of which Oceans North is one of those 8 members. And Sea Blue works together to help Canada meet its 30 by 30 marine conservation target. And so through Sea Blue, we've been learning about the regulatory landscape in Canada and tracking these mCDR and more broad marine geoengineering projects nationally across all 3 coasts. And so from an Oceans North perspective, at Oceans North, we work really closely with many communities across the country whose livelihoods and cultures depend on healthy marine ecosystems. And if those ecosystems are affected, environmental risks can quickly cascade into social and economic ones, which can have far-reaching impacts on food security, cultural practices, and local economies. And right now, in what we've learned, that Canada's regulatory framework on mCDR does not adequately consider the social, economic, and human risks associated with these projects. And in its absence, we run the risk of repeating the mistakes of the past, where communities with the least capacity to assess and respond to new activities are often the most exposed to their consequences. And without clear standards for engagement, communities also do not have a clear path forward for sharing the benefits, potential benefits from mCDR. One of the clearest gaps that we've seen is the lack of defined thresholds for Indigenous consultation and community benefits. And we shouldn't assume that communities will necessarily oppose these projects in all cases. In fact, many communities may see opportunities or benefits, but we must ask, what are those benefits? And how are risks being assessed and managed? And we ask these questions of many other sectors in Canada, such as mining, oil and gas, and offshore wind. And this emerging sector should be held to the same standard. And we have seen some mCDR companies engaging with communities at a local level, and we see that as a positive step. But right now, that engagement is largely voluntary, since there are no consistent regulatory mechanisms that ensure communities have the information, resources, and capacity that they need to evaluate these projects and meaningfully participate in decision making around these projects. And so just like other sectors where the government of Canada has a duty to consult in cases where Indigenous rights may be impacted, mCDR should not be treated differently simply because it is new or being framed as a climate solution. Communities deserve clarity on what is being proposed, what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, if any, and how that will flow to them. Yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic, Sarah, and thank you for the very comprehensive response. I think it's really important, as you said, to think about the risks, but also think about the potential benefits and how this would be shared with these local communities. And as you said, it's so important to have an informed decision, not that they're going to be against directly, but just making sure that they have the right to express themselves and make sure that it's an informed discussion. But definitely identified it as one of the main gaps, whether it's in the assessments, but also in the regulatory frameworks. And perhaps we can dive a bit deeper in this question of regulatory frameworks and the governance. As Laurent mentioned, it has been identified as one of the key gaps, making sure that the governance framework are strengthened and just able to keep up with the science. So that's actually a question that I have for you, Yulika. I would love to get to understand a bit better, this government framework, the landscape, and how we could strengthen it.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen, and hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to see this webinar happening. Yeah, I think, as many people have pointed to, governance is a crucial issue in this context, not only because science is evolving, but also because there's a huge economic interest. So we see startups all over the world lining up as states and governments fail to reach their climate targets, and enterprises do as well. So the huge risk of them trying to make benefit from this as a solution for failed mitigation efforts or insufficient mitigation efforts is huge. But just to provide a brief overview on how mCDR is governed today. So there's not one individual particular framework that's part of the problem. There's actually a patchwork of partially overlapping and often insufficient frameworks, which creates a risk which is called forum shopping. So different actors deciding which forum to go to advocate for their interest with regard to mCDR. At the international level, what are the key frameworks that apply? We have UNCLOS, the law of the sea, that regulates more or less all uses of the ocean. In particular, the London Convention and London Protocol under UNCLOS reference mCDR in particular, and it's the only international framework that does so. It regulates dumping. And part of the methods we've seen presented in the beginning by Laurent fall under the realm of this convention and protocol. Then we have the BB&J agreement, which is going to be important in the future once procedures have been established, because it also regulates the effect of activities in the sea, in the high seas, but also in national waters on the marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, actually established a de facto moratorium on deployment of mCDR, but the definition there is broader. It refers to geoengineering. And then there's, of course, the UNFCCC, where the whole debate originates from. So, of course, we acknowledge the finding by the IPCC that CDR might be necessary to, actually is necessary to achieve the climate goals, but there is currently still a lack of guidance. So that's probably one of the biggest gaps. There's no coherent assessment framework. The different frameworks focus on few techniques, mainly ocean fertilization, and are, in the case of the London Convention and Protocol, not sufficiently ratified. I think to finish here, and we have more time on governance later, what shows quite clearly how unclear the regulation still is at the international level is a current debate about if the recent ITLOS advisory opinion on if climate change, in particular greenhouse gas emissions, can be seen as pollution to the marine environment. So this is used both ways. It's used as an argument against mCDR, adding additional carbon to the ocean, but it's also used as an argument for mCDR, saying we need to prevent the ocean from further increase of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So these unclarities persist. So we really need to strengthen and harmonize the international framework, and then, of course, crucial for everything, ensure effective translation into national law.
Well, thank you, Julika. This is very clear, and as you said, there's translation of these different commitments on the national law, making sure that we continue to implement the decisions that have been undertaken, even some that might be forgotten, some ones like this de facto moratorium that you mentioned from the Biodiversity Convention that actually goes back to 2010. So that is quite an older one. But I also really appreciated that you mentioned the forum shopping. I think it's a very good expression that really shows that some of the actors might target the frameworks where we have lower regulation, where it's more permissive, and then trying to forget about these other decisions that are already there. But that was very clear. So thank you very much for that. Moving on to our next panelist, we've been talking about how these different frameworks talk about research, how it's supposed to be supporting the research. So I would love to go back to that and ask you, Rama, why is scientific research needed on mCDR? And perhaps also a bit more specifically, since there's funding at risk for ocean observation, which is an important part of the research right now. Why is this ocean observation system so critical to this effort?
Thank you very much, Marine. As you know, I'm an international lawyer, but I'll be channeling my scientific colleagues to answer the question that you have posed for me. Before that, let me just say a word about the Woodsole Oceanographic Institution, as we call it, WHOI. It is approaching its centennial, and it is home to more than about 1,100 scientists, engineers, and students working from the polar regions to the tropics and virtually everywhere in between. In addition to our research enterprise, we also operate one of the world's leading doctoral programs in oceanography with MIT. Marine carbon dioxide removal is not a new subject for WHOI. Our scientists have been investigating aspects of these approaches for nearly 4 decades through carefully designed small-scale research. What we still do not know, this is a point that has been made by several of us, starting with Laurent, is whether any of these approaches can be deployed safely, effectively, and at a scale. That's the important part. Safely, effectively, and at a scale that would make a meaningful contribution to addressing climate change. That is why I think your question is such an important one, and I'd like to make three very brief points. First, why research? This has also been addressed by other panelists, and very simply put, we don't know enough. mCDR is not an alternative to rapid fossil fuel phase out, the so-called moral hazard that we keep talking about. But given the climate crisis and the failure to reduce emissions fast enough, it would be irresponsible, in my view, not to understand whether the ocean has a carefully governed role to play. This is a point that has been made by others, but more eloquently by Laurent in his introductory remarks. The second point, why observation? You raised that question, Marine. So the ocean is not a laboratory beaker. It is a dynamic, interconnected system. Without sustained observations, we cannot establish baselines, verify carbon removal, detect ecological impacts, or assess permanence, all of which are vitally important. The last point I want to make is what is needed. Well, research without observation is speculation. Governments must invest in observing systems, long-term science, transparent data, and of course, independent MRV. What I'd like to say, however, is this in closing. When you look at the title, Haste Makes Waste, one would get away a reaction that it might be telling only half the story. The other half could actually be delay leads to disaster. The challenge before us is not choosing between haste and delay, but it's about learning how to practice responsible urgency. I'm very fond of quoting Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations. He quotes a title of a movie that talks about everything, everywhere, all at once. I mean, the problem is so huge, we really have to do something about it. So let me conclude with just one sentence. Precaution is not a synonym for delay. It is a discipline for acting responsibly in the face of uncertainty. Haste can indeed make waste, but delay can also lead to disaster. Over to you, Marine.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rama. And thank you for channeling your inner scientist, although you're a lawyer, definitely. I really appreciated in particular that you reaffirmed the importance of rapid emissions reduction. I think it was Caitlin also who highlighted it, and it has to be and to remain the priority in this context. And I also really appreciated that you mentioned how these different systems are interconnected. I think it goes back to Laurent's point on transboundary impacts and the importance of really understanding these different interconnections. So that was very clear. But perhaps if we continue on this question on the different opportunities and how to strengthen research, Caitlin, I would love to ask you, how can we balance fundamental science, the laboratory studies, and the field experiments while ensuring that research activities themselves are conducted safely and responsibly?
Yes, as I shared before, and Rama just reminded us, we still do have a lot to learn about our ocean. And so I think firstly, funding and effort should continue to support fundamental research into physical, chemical, biological oceanography to increase our understanding of current carbon and nutrient cycles, as well as ecosystem functioning and biological work. We have to invest in that science now in ocean observations and modeling approaches and infrastructure and capacity building so that we have sufficient knowledge to build on. And yet, this group of authors believes that field experiments for mCDR can indeed complement fundamental research. At this time, we think it's most appropriate that this field work is limited to small or mesoscale non-commercial tests to reduce financial incentives into particular outcomes. And those sorts of results coming out of this work should include indications that continuation wouldn't jeopardize environmental safety. And again, we think it's important that these tests are only conducted to advance scientific knowledge at this stage. But transparency among all the actors working on this will help build confidence as we further our understanding of the potential benefits and the potential limitations of different approaches and help us identify where further investments of time and resources can be made. We encourage publication in peer-reviewed journals as one such step, but another aspect of that is contributing to the creation of comprehensive monitoring, reporting, and verification protocols for independently assessing carbon and environmental conditions. We think these must be established to track ocean health and assess the effectiveness of all the various mCDR approaches to determine additionality and permanence and contribute to more credibility in the mCDR field as it grows. We also believe that the additionality of carbon capture, environmental safety must be demonstrated through robust and transparent reporting, environmental impact assessments and life cycle assessments, with those results published and subject to peer review too. That's, I think, really important, especially for those approaches that utilize feedstocks or altering seawater chemistry at a point source. So this is all an important balance for our research community. There's still a lot to learn about the nuances of these different mCDR approaches, and along the way, we'll undoubtedly learn more exciting things about our ocean, but continuing to advance basic oceanographic monitoring and observation, biological studies, et cetera, especially in underobserved regions by local scientists, is critical to our future as well.
Fantastic, Caitlin. And your last point, I think, was very strong on the need also to strengthen the research in some of the different areas of the world. You mentioned different things, including the importance of independent and transparent research, which I found was really strong. Perhaps building on that, I want to turn over to you, Sean, and to ask you a bit more details on this. Why is it so pivotal to ensure the independence and transparency on scientific research? I think it was Yudica who mentioned, the economic gains that might be behind mCDR. So, what are also the safeguards that are needed to prevent commercial interest from influencing mCDR research and outcomes? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen, and thank you for inviting me to represent the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition today. Our coalition is over 140 member organizations, many of whom are represented here today. So we have been working for 20 years now to address the key threats to deep ocean health, to biodiversity in the deep ocean. And our two main campaigns have been addressing the threat of destructive fisheries and addressing the incoming threat of deep sea mining. And so we're looking at kind of mCDR and the wider geoengineering question with that filter, right? What kind of threat does this pose to the ocean? And as you know, many of the panelists here today have very clearly put forward, we are in this very difficult situation of balancing, as an ocean community, ocean health against the very real urgency of addressing climate change. The deep ocean is 95% of the living space on this planet. And when we talk about the ocean, a couple of people have mentioned how the ocean is the primary reservoir for carbon storage. It's the biodiversity of the ocean. So it's not just the ocean is the reservoir, it's the healthy ocean, right? It's the biodiverse ocean that is the reservoir. And so we come at this discussion very much aware that there are trade-offs that are going to need to be made, that are already being made. And I think what's important to your question on independence and transparency is who is at the table? And my other panelists have already spoken to the risks, the ecological risks, the social risks, where does the liability sit? All of these questions are very real, but who's making the decisions? Where are those decisions being made, and who is part of that? Where is the equity? Where is the justice? Where are the stakeholders? So we're seeing that a majority of mCDR funding at the moment goes toward field trials that are driven by commercial interests. That's a huge risk to this, to a potential tragedy of the commons for the ocean. And we've seen that with oil and gas, and we've seen that with fisheries, and we are in a position now as a global community to take the lessons that we've learned and apply them. And I think a number of the panelists have spoken to some really real and important options for how we take those lessons and apply them moving forward here.
Thank you very much. And it's a great question to always ask who is at the table. Absolutely. And perhaps to answer this question, turning over back to you, Sarah, and your experience from Nova Scotia. You're working on the ground, so it's very interesting for us to get the feedback on how it's actually happening. What do you think are the lessons from these different projects about the safeguards, the oversight mechanisms, the carbon market rules to prevent premature deployment and ensure that communities remain meaningfully involved in decision making?
Thank you. Yes, I can provide a little bit of an overview about what we've learned about the regulatory landscape in Canada to paint the picture a little bit on the ground. And so, as I mentioned, through SeaBlue, we've been tracking some of these projects and learning about this regulatory landscape. And what we've learned is that the government approach in Canada to mCDR is piecemeal, and there's no clear, coherent, overarching framework. And in Nova Scotia specifically, where I live, we've become aware of 3 companies conducting or proposing various mCDR projects. But of course, there's many other across our very large country. And so what we've learned is that currently none of these projects operating are designated under the Federal Impact Assessment Act in Canada, which is how most large resource development projects would progress through an environmental impact assessment. And Canada implements the London Protocol through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, but the SEPA's ocean dumping rules don't really apply to land-based sources, which is how many ocean alkalinity enhancement projects operate. And so as a result, these projects have been able to operate under provincial discharge permits for the most part, rather than an overarching federal oversight. And then Environment and Climate Change Canada's guidance generally relies on the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment guidelines. But these guidelines are much more developed for land-based activities than for the marine environment. So already we've identified two major gaps. And so the strongest federal regulatory tool is the subsection 36 of our Fisheries Act, and that prohibits deleterious substances being deposited into any waters that are frequented by fish. But in practice, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, again at the federal level, has often issued letters of advice, which is basically the lowest bar for regulatory authorization, which comes with minimal monitoring requirements and really no requirement for community engagement or, like I mentioned before, any Indigenous formal consultation through Canada's obligation to their duty to consult. And so we've also learned that many of these projects in Canada are being financed through voluntary carbon markets, which I know a few of the panelists have alluded to as well. And so this is happening at the same time that Environment and Climate Change Canada is developing criteria for high integrity carbon credits. And this is in alignment with the Coalition to Grow Carbon Markets that Canada joined at COP30. And there's also, it's happening as interest in carbon markets continues to really grow in Canada and internationally across academia, government, and industry. And so really all of this just points to the need for much more coherent oversight and effectively assessing and regulating these novel projects should begin with a strategic environmental impact assessment, like Caitlin alluded to before, of these technologies under Canada's Impact Assessment Act. And this would allow independent scientists to evaluate their efficacy, risks, opportunity costs, and potential benefits, like I mentioned before. Yeah, I'll leave it at that in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And you made a very strong point on how, the national government should also seize this question of mCDR and make sure that they have a national regulation that translates the international law and decisions that have been undertaken already. So that was very strong. And something that has been coming up, I think, several times is the question of fisheries that several of you mentioned. And I think it's also a very strong point, especially when it comes to the impacts on coastal communities after that. So that was very interesting. You also mentioned earlier the question of mining, because it's one of the topics on which you work with Oceans North. Obviously, we have a deep sea conservation coalition, so I do have to ask the question to you, Sean. We know that there's a lot of parallels between mCDR and deep sea mining. So can you perhaps elaborate on the lessons that we could have from deep sea mining on mCDR research and governance?
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. There are a lot of parallels. I mean, this is an unproven technology that's being driven hard by a number of commercial interests, by a lot of private money in a global ocean space, right? In the space that is for where we are all stakeholders and where we need to take into account the impacts on future generations as well. What my fellow panelists have already mentioned about the tremendous uncertainty, right? The tremendous scientific uncertainty, both about what's there to begin with and how a healthy ocean is already supporting planetary health and regulating our climate and providing food and income security, et cetera, as well as what the impacts of this unproven technology are going to deliver. So there are many similarities in terms of the risks, also the liability that I mentioned earlier, and then from a governance perspective. In the deep sea mining space, we have the International Seabed Authority, which has been working for 20 years now to negotiate a regulatory framework for mining, and it is nowhere near ready. So the more conversations that are had across the relevant stakeholders, across the states and the observers and the Indigenous peoples, and the more groups that are getting involved, the clearer it is that we don't have alignment and clarity on how to move this forward. As Ulrika said, we don't yet have anywhere near that governance framework in place for mCDR. So that is very much a lesson, and that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the voices at the table. The reliance on carbon credit revenues for mCDR during the research phase is prematurely commercializing this potential industry. This is something that we haven't yet had to deal with in deep sea mining. So there's a different set of risks that is emerging because mCDR commercialization seems to be proceeding so much more quickly, also in response to how the carbon markets are developing. So that's something that requires a lot of attention.
Thank you, Shannon. As you said, it's impressive to see that it's been 20 years within the International Seabed Authority, and I do hope that we'll be able to do better with the topic of mCDR. But that's perhaps a good question that I can ask my next panelist, Rama. I would be keen to hear, according to you, where is mCDR governance heading? What should be the priorities moving forward? We've heard from some colleagues, but I'd love to have your take on that as well.
Thank you very much, Marian. Before I respond to that, let me very quickly react to a couple of points made. I totally agree with the suggestion that the commercial interests financing field research is a mistake. That doesn't give us any confidence on the results. And if governments and the philanthropic foundations are serious about finding climate solutions, they have to put in the money. And the second point is there is also the universal, some kind of a uniform frameworks are important. And the sooner we come up with what it is and how to go about doing them, the better everyone would be. And the last point is we have acquired permits from the EPA to carry out field studies on ocean alkalinity enhancement. And we have gone through the whole procedure, not only in terms of the proposal being open for public comments from everybody to having conversations with local communities uh, several times. The first few times it was a very rocky conversation, but over a period of time, we were able to move forward to a point where we felt that the community felt that they had the comfort level, and then we were able to proceed with it. So it's a tricky business, but an important one. So we need to walk the extra mile to make sure that the people understand what it is that we're trying to do and why we are doing it and where that money is coming from. So those are all important points, and we should keep that in mind. I just want to add one more thing, which is to uh, to equate seabed mining with marine CDR might be a stretch bit too far. They're completely different purposes, and we need to be mindful of that. And I don't want to belabor that point much at this stage, but I just wanted to make that thing. Vis-a-vis the governance point is, I think Yulika covered that very well. All that I want to say is the climate system is changing faster than our institutions are adapting. And it's very evident in coastal regions and small island developing states that are already developing and that are already living with the consequences. So the governance challenge, as far as I'm concerned, is again uh, to create a framework for responsible urgency. The governance must prevent premature commercialization, very important. Exaggerated claims. I have seen all kinds of things floating about, how we can take 1 billion tons tomorrow, if only we put enough money into it. And large scale deployment before we in the scientific community is ready with the answers about all the issues that I talked about before. But so all that it means is that we must actively enable rigorous, transparent, independently reviewed scientific research to proceed. Again, my pet theme here is precaution should never become an argument for paralysis. Yulika covered all the various conventions, though that's my favorite topic. I'm not going to belabor that. But the fact of the matter is, there is an enormous amount of fragmentation in the structures, and then that creates uncertainty, or as she called it, form shopping for scientists, regulators, investors, and the public alike. We need clarity, and the sooner we get that, the better we would all be. The last point I want to make is that as we think about governance, it should rest on few fundamental principles. And mitigation first, science before credit, no deployment without robust monitoring, reporting and verification, and transparency and open data, and of course, strong environmental safeguards. I don't mean to ignore, but we absolutely need meaningful public participation in this and equity for developing countries and smaller and developing states. And lastly, clear accountability and liability provisions. Ultimately, of course, precaution should guide mCDR governance toward better science, stronger institutions, and wiser decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. And I think wiser decision can only be the good ending word. We haven't been able yet to discuss a bit more about, how to strengthen this aspect of mobilizing local communities, making sure that they're informed. We've talked about it in our introduction. So if you have some best practices to share later on, it will be really interesting to hear. But in the meantime, happy to pass over the floor to Julika so that she can tell us a bit more about how concretely we can have meaningful community engagement and how governance could better embed equity and human rights to prevent all of the different impacts that we've discussed.
Thanks, Maureen. I feel my internet connection is not at its best, so I hope you can still hear me. And I'll try to be super brief, recognizing that we are over time already. Rama has excellently referred to the guiding principles for coordinated global framework that is needed. And we've heard from Sarah about the challenges and needs in terms of community engagement. Just very overarchingly, I think it's extremely important to make the point that we can already see how economic power imbalances and legislative disparities lead to mCDR on field trial level, but being deployed in regions that are less economically powerful, for example. At the moment, there is a roadmap for mCDR under development for the African continent. We don't know exactly how this is going to look like yet, but these developments open up room for economic interests to be far too strong. So clearly here, guidance and good regulation is actually needed, and coherent, harmonized guidance. Secondly, connecting more to the local level, all research, all field trials must be grounded in FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. It can't be only consultations. It needs to be a two-way process, and communities need the access to courts potentially to defend their rights and to also refuse projects. What can be done at a global level to ensure that equity and human rights are better embedded? Next to having this harmonized approach, and oceans could play a role in that, we see two potential main steps. A UNEA resolution, which would not only address the human rights and equity aspect, but could include it, but could help recalling the precaution principle and develop this shared assessment framework that is needed beyond what's been presented by the London Protocol so far. But we could also ask the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution specifically on the effective protection of human rights in mCDR research and potentially in the future deployments. I'll leave it here and thank all my fellow panelists. I've also learned a lot and it was great to discuss with you, and I'll leave it to you, Maureen, for the closing remarks.
Fantastic, Julika, and thank you also for mentioning the roadmap that is under development on the African continent right now. I think it's, you mentioned the forum shopping earlier. I think we should do the same with the site shopping and make sure that we don't target countries that have a weaker regulation, and make sure we just build the capacity for informed discussion as we've been discussing earlier today. I'm not going to be very long because we're over time, as you said. I just wanted to thank everyone, and I hope everyone can join me in giving you a big round of virtual applause. Thank you for having shared some rich and thought-provoking insights with us today. It has been particularly helpful knowing this is quite a complex and often divisive issue. So thank you very much for that. I think the points on remaining uncertainties were very clear, whether it was on the different questions around effectiveness, around the potential ecological and social risks, but also around the governance framework landscapes that remain too fragmented and not really equipped to address these different emerging challenges. I think we have a very strong conclusion that at this stage, mCDR cannot be considered as a climate solution, that we should not rely on the promise of the future carbon removal, as there is still risk that it may divert political attention, all the financial resources from ready to implement decarbonization solution, which should, as many of you have stressed, remain the urgent and drastic priority. We all agree that science and scientific research is necessary to better understand the risk and the potential, especially in the context of the climate emergency, but that still research must be conducted safely and equitably. I think many of you have highlighted strong points in terms of MRV, in terms of independent and transparent research, making sure that the research is not driven by economic gains and that it's not leading to any premature deployment. Of course, as I said, the climate urgency is undeniable, but I think it's really important to stress that slow progress on emissions reduction cannot justify actions that risk undermining ecological integrity. It is really when the stakes are highest that safeguards must be the strongest, and the ocean has been a quiet ally for a very long time, absorbing the heat, absorbing the carbon, and it's important to really preserve its integrity to make sure we can continue to have this different regulating role in absorbing carbon and heat. So if today has sparked your interest, I encourage you to read the 3 publications that my colleague Victor has introduced in the beginning of this webinar. I think some colleagues will share the links in the chat now. And with that, I would like to thank again the partners, Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, Ocean Climate Platform, Oceans North, the Ocean Foundation, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and WWF for their support in organizing this webinar. Thank you again to our panelists for their expertise and for all of you joining us online that are taking the time to attend and join us today. So I wish you all a wonderful evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. And that's it for me. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.